Dobry wieczór, witam Was bardzo ciepło i serdecznie na kolejnym webinarium VR Poland, czyli Światowego Instytutu Action Learning. Ja mam na imię Tomek i z przyjemnością poprowadzę dla Was to webinarium, tak jak zwykle prowadzę poprzednie i następne pewnie też poprowadzę. Słuchajcie, zanim zaczniemy, to przede wszystkim namawiam Was do tego, żebyście notowali ważne dla Was rzeczy, dlatego że nie będzie żadnej prezentacji, będzie tylko konwersacja. Zaraz się dowiecie z kim, chociaż pewnie wiecie z kim, ale zaraz jeszcze przedstawię naszego gościa, bo zaraz wspólnie z nim na ekranie mnie zobaczycie. Jeśli chcecie brać udział w dyskusji, zadawać pytania, zalogujcie się do YouTube'a, wtedy możecie wziąć udział w czacie. Często duża ilość z Was wybiera, żeby nie logować się do YouTube'a i po prostu oglądać. To jest jak najbardziej ok, ale jeśli chcecie zadawać jakieś pytania, albo być z nami w jakimś kontakcie, no to tylko przez czat. Tak jak widzę, że Piotrek tutaj już pisze do nas hello. Słuchajcie, poleci teraz krótka czołówka, a zaraz potem dołączę do Was z gościem. Jest Sebastian, cześć. Jeśli jesteście w ogóle zalogowani do YouTube'a, piszcie coś na czacie. No a ja już włączam czołówkę i zaraz wracam do Was z naszym gościem. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I'm gonna switch to English. I have an amazing guest tonight with us, a former executive at Constellation Energy and currently an executive coach who helps other managers with their work. Frank Andriacchi is with us. Hello, Frank. How are you doing?
How are you doing, Thomas? I'm doing very well today.
I'm very well too, thank you. Frank, what is action learning for you?
Well, action learning for me, A, I found it to be very powerful, but B, at first when I was introduced to it, I did not understand it. So helping people understanding action learning is important because as an executive, if it wasn't for a major problem I was having, I probably wouldn't have been drawn to it. But when it was pointed out as an excellent tool for problem solving, and then once I saw it work, it became even more powerful. But it did take a little time to understand it.
Mm-hmm. So imagine you have a manager, like a colleague, who doesn't know what action learning is. How would you describe to him or her in a few words what action learning is really all about, what a meeting like that looks like?
I would explain that we've all been in meetings where there's a problem and you sit around and everyone starts giving solutions. The only trouble is when that meeting ends, you still have the problem. With action learning, where you can only ask questions about the problem, that does drive you to solutions, or it shows that the problem is complex. It has multiple parts and you break it apart and you solve one piece of the problem at a time.
Thanks very much, Frank. So for all those of you who are new to action learning, who maybe are here for the first time in our webinar, just one sentence of explanation, like Frank said, action learning is primarily for problem solving. It's a process for problem solving, but at the same time, people who take part, usually small teams, also focus on learning, and learning means drawing conclusions from how they work so they can work better. So it's action and learning combined. Action is working on real problems and learning is increasing the quality of work. Frank, before our webinar, you told me about two major problems that you faced in your company. But just to make sure everybody understands what your role in that company was, tell us a few words, what your position was and what your responsibilities were.
I was a vice president and chief operating officer of Constellation Energy, and we had 39 projects in 13 different states in the United States and one in Canada, of all different sizes and staffing. And my job really was to oversee those sites and resolve any issues at the sites.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Okay. And what were the two problems that you faced? Let's start with the first one. Tell us what happened. What was the urgent issue that you had to resolve, and then we will talk about what was done to resolve it and what effects, what results you saw.
Okay. So for my very first exposure to action learning, the major problem was within one site, the staffing was primarily related to two different families. And at this site, the two families did not get along. And to help your audience, these plants run 24 hours a day. So you have people working 12 hours, then off 12 hours, etc. The second family felt that the plant manager who came from one family was really mistreating them. At risk was what we call in the industry an operator bonus of 4 million US dollars above and beyond all other benefit. So if we couldn't resolve the issue, the corporation would not get that $4 million or be eligible for it. So that was the issue that drove me to action learning.
So let me make sure I understand it. The issue was so important that if not resolved, you could have lost those $4 million?
Correct. Because the operator bonus was contingent on production, and production was going down. And we would have never qualified for a bonus.
Mm-hmm.
As a matter of fact, if it went so low, we would not have even qualified for our fee. So
okay.
The very obvious bonus was the extra production, which under current conditions would never be obtained.
Can you tell us a few words more about the problem? You said that some people felt mistreated by the new manager.
Right. They felt all the benefits went to his family members or friends, and
Okay.
they got day shifts, not night shifts, not working weekends. So they felt there was a huge disparity.
So I'm
And that,
yeah, carry on.
and that caused significant friction between the staff. And when you have friction, obviously things don't go well because it's a handoff from one family to the other family twice a day.
Right.
Which,
right. Okay. And at some point, you decided to, or I don't know, somebody decided to use action learning in that context, in that problem. How did it all start?
Okay. I was the one who decided to use action learning. It all started because my wife at the time was getting her doctorate from Dr. Mike Marquardt. And my wife, Dr. B. Carson's well involved with action learning, as most of you know, or at least Thomas knows. But she was at that time a student and told me about how powerful this problem solving and learning tool was. And I actually hired Mike to be a coach. And a coach is very important. I can get into that later, but having a coach one of these sessions is critical. And it was solely my decision. And we did hold a session to work on the problem. Mike did come in ahead of time and run a trial with me to show me how action learning worked. So I can honestly say demonstrating on something simple on how it works to a possible client is very beneficial.
Okay, so that's tip number one for everybody watching out there. If you know action learning, you probably studied with me, and I often encourage you guys to do a demonstration in the company that is considering hiring you for some kind of team coaching or problem solving. But even if you guys don't know action learning very well yet, whatever process you do that's kind of specific, that's cohesive, that's something different from what people normally do, it's probably a good idea to demonstrate it on something simple, like Frank said, so that people get a taste of it and are not surprised with what happens in the session when they are actually working on the urgent and important problem that they want to solve. So Frank, can you tell us more about what Mike did with you guys? You told us that he came ahead of time, he did a demonstration session. What happened next?
What happened next was we actually met at the location of this plant. And as Mike described action learning to me, it had to be a meeting of at least 4 people, but no more than 8. It was very good to have someone not involved at all with the issue, and if possible, to have the decision maker present. So if at all possible. So
you, I guess, because you were the decision maker, correct?
Correct. I controlled the pocketbook if the decision cost money. So, but this is important. When I attended the meeting, I was no longer an executive vice president. I just was one of 8 attendees. Mike also indicated that to have someone from a totally different site attend that didn't know the problem. So this particular site was a fuel processing site, and I had a technician from a gas turbine site join the meeting.
Why did he suggest that? Why did he suggest somebody totally from outside of the problem?
He said it's always good to have what he called a pizza person. And this is someone who, quote unquote, does not ask what people think of as the dumb questions, but they ask the questions basically around help me understand. And they ask very intriguing questions that the group, who are usually deeply involved and entrenched in the problem, don't see. So what he called the pizza person helped greatly in just asking questions, which then led to a very good solution.
So did you actually see the power of that pizza person in your meetings?
Oh, definitely. He was very active and had no experience or knowledge or friendship with any of the other attendees. He came from over 1,000 miles away to attend.
Wow.
So I put a little money in, I invested some money in this in the hope it'd be successful.
Yeah. So I guess this can be another tip for everybody out there who's trying to help their clients, maybe external or internal clients, if you guys work in-house, in organizations, that if you really are trying to do some group problem solving, it may really be a good idea to invite somebody who has very little or no knowledge about the problem, but maybe has the ability to ask questions and cooperate effectively and communicate and is engaged, so that that person can really ask some fresh questions totally from out of the box and cast some new light and fresh look at the whole problem and the whole situation. So how many sessions, how many meetings did it take to come up with some solutions?
It's a split answer. It took 2 days, which was amazingly fast. The first day, the morning was spent just teaching the 8 of us action learning. So I went through about how you ask questions. There's a question presenter. All you're allowed to do is ask questions, and ideally open-ended questions. And anyone can ask a question of anyone else, and anyone can answer. you also pointed out that was very powerful for learning. So myself, I am a terrible listener. So I picked listening, and I learned to listen, truthfully, a lot better at this meeting than ever before. After that morning session, we broke for lunch, and in the afternoon, the problem was presented. And for about 15 minutes, many questions were asked of each other about the problem. And then he asked us to write down what we all thought the problem was.
Okay.
And then we put that problem up, which was slightly different than the first problem. And we did that again, and basically a couple of times until dinner time. And this is where I really learned the power of action learning. We broke for dinner, and we all went out, ate together. Everyone was cordial because we had both families represented, 3 from each side. So it wasn't like, the cards were stacked one way or the other. The next morning, we weren't to start till 8 o'clock. I show up at the conference room early, and they're already developing solutions, because as we slept, everyone in their mind, the mind's amazing, it was working on it. And as a group, they said, here's what the real problem is. It wasn't really the shifts per se or anything. It was how it was decided they went on the shifts, and there'd be a slight change to the shift schedule, and the cost of the change was within the budget. So it was a little more money, but not significantly more. And they actually worked out a solution of how to vote on the shifts. There were 3 different ones that would work, because it's a very complex thing for people who don't work in an industry that goes 24/7. When you go 7 days a week, shifts are very easy. When you go 6 days a week and no one works on a Sunday, so from 12:01 a.m. Sunday to midnight Sunday, the plant must be shut down.
Okay, and that's more difficult than when everything goes 7 days a week?
Around the clock, right, because around the clock you can do rolling things, work 4, off 3, then work 3, off 4. You can, when there's a 6-day shift by 24 hours does not work.
Okay.
So they actually came up with a scheme.
And
different ones.
Let me understand it. They were coming up with those solutions the next day, even before you guys started the next session?
Right. When we went in, they had ideas up on the board. Then the next session actually was more on how they present this and how to be fair. So they came up with how to vote on the 3 possibilities, how at a safety and information meeting explain the differences between the 3 possibilities, and then once selected, because there are different worker classifications, each classification, how they would pick, how they'd actually assign which shift you'd be on. So it was first voting on one of the A, B, or C solutions, and then B, how you staff those solutions. So we spent the next morning really using action learning and asking questions, coming up with a very fair and equitable way of A, presenting the 3 options, and then B, staffing the 3 options with obviously no family prejudice involved.
Okay, so that was, as I understand it, that was 1.5 days in total. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, and then so the next morning, that was the last session. You guys came up with the ultimate solutions that day, right?
It was unbelievably quick. I was truly amazed.
Mm-hmm. Tell us something about the results you saw. How did it all work out?
It all worked out that site had absolutely no safety violations. It had no accidents. And from that point, for the next 8 years while it was in operation, they always met and exceeded operator bonus targets. So it was working extremely well.
Can you tell us the numbers? Can you remember the numbers? I remember you said that the problem was that you faced actually losing $4 million if this problem was not solved. And now then, thinking that you guys actually solved it, did you manage to get those $4 million or?
Yes. Yeah, that's my point. To get the bonus, you can't have accidents, you can't have safety violations, and you can't have environmental violations, but you also have to exceed production.
Okay.
So you have to exceed certain production numbers, and the more you exceed it, the better the bonus.
Right.
So and I don't have, it's been a few years now, but roughly, if it didn't work, we would have lost 4 million times 8 years, assuming the owner didn't kick us out. It would have been, at some point, you actually risk breach of contract.
Right.
If you look at the total downside. But the upside was about $32 million.
$32 million.
Over 8 years.
Wow. I don't know how much Mike charged, but I'm assuming it was well worth it.
Yes. And obviously I can't disclose that. They're both Mike's charging, my paying, well, the company, not me, paying for the hotel, the meals, and the transportation for both Mike and obviously the technician that came from 1,000 miles away. It was an excellent investment.
Frank, before we move on to the other problem, if when you're thinking about the whole situation and what Mike did as a consultant, for those of you who don't know Mike, check out Mike Marquardt online. He's like the father of, or the godfather of WILE action learning. When I say WILE, I mean the World Institute for Action Learning. So when you're looking at the whole situation, do you have any other tips or advice that you could give to other coaches and trainers and maybe team coaches or problem-solving consultants out there that are looking to do the best work possible?
Well, the advice comes in when you meet with prospective clients. Make available to them the ability to talk to others that have used action learning. So if you can access other executives or managers who have benefited from it, that's very powerful. Obviously, the demonstration session is important. The learning piece of it's also powerful. And there's one that we don't talk about too much. It actually is team building. Those two families that necessarily didn't get along. After this first very simple action learning session with only a small sample from each family, 3 each, it was excellent for team building. And the families got along much better after the session. You sometimes have to warn your clients that what they present as a problem could be a complex problem, which might take multiple sessions, meeting, say, once a month to work on. The ability to work on it, and as I said, people slept overnight, letting your mind work while you're sleeping or away from it also is beneficial. And a lot of times you might go 4 days in a row, or you might go once a month. It depends on availability of the attendees.
Thanks so much, Frank. Let's move on to the other problem. Tell us about the other situation that you faced that was so urgent that you had to take some actions on.
Okay, this actually involved 4 different sites that were going to shut down on a specific date where all the employees would be unemployed, possibly unemployed. Let's see, from the time we held Action Learning, it would have been 7 years later. So in 7 years, they knew the site had to close, 4 different sites. We then used representatives from each site to come up with what we said was a retention plan. So what would be...
So 4 sites were closing down, is that correct?
4.
4 of them, okay.
That had to do with contracts. I won't go into those details,
Sure.
but it was a known. At the time, hiring and employment, once you were unemployed, was a risk. So once they lost a relatively good paying job as a technician at one of these sites, being reemployed at a comparable wage could have been difficult.
So I'm assuming in their best interest was not to become unemployed.
Right, to leave, especially let's say in year 7, as you know, it's ending, is start looking for other employment,
right,
and leave. And then if the plant shut down or we couldn't staff it, that'd be a major problem, because just like our first case, everything, compensation was all based on production and safety. And if you don't have the staff, it's impossible to run a site safely.
Right.
So this did take a number of sessions. We used one representative from each site. We used a couple of representatives from another site. I didn't attend all the sessions because what we asked them to do was come up with a benefit plan that would have to be approved by the board of directors of the corporation. Now, for those in Poland, Constellation Energy at that time was a Fortune 100 company. So we're in the top 100. So we're talking a significant board of directors that would have to approve this defined plan.
Okay.
Again, we always had a coach, an Action Learning certified coach for the session.
Was it only one group working on the problem?
Just one group representing all 4 sites.
Okay.
But we had a representative from each site. I do not recall the number of times they met. It wasn't too many times, because in relatively short order, they came up with a retention plan that worked. And they also came up with the criteria.
Okay, so let me just make sure I understand the problem exactly. So 4 sites were closing down, and they had to retain their employees until the very last day. And at the same time, for those employees, in their best interest was to search for another job before the last day, because they didn't want to become unemployed. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
And put yourself in that employee's position. What would you do? You'd look for another job.
Of course.
So the retention plan they came up with was, for every month you worked, we deposited so much money in an account for you. And then at the end of what they called was the defined release date. Now, this is important, because when you shut one of these sites down, not everyone leaves on the last day.
Okay.
You have to secure things. So you phase out. So when operations stops, your staff drops by about 75%.
So the last day isn't really the last day for those guys.
For some, but not for all.
Right.
So they came up with, if you stayed till the defined release date, and we asked who wanted to stay on and who wanted to depart. And if you were not released for cause, in other words, if someone did something that violated the handbook, you wouldn't obtain the savings account, the retention plan set up for
Right.
you. In parallel, we provided resume writing services. We provided training for those who wanted training, for those who were working to become a fully certified technician or something. And we provided reference materials for them to contact prospective employers. The actual result was no one left until the assigned date. A few people said they would retire.
Okay.
But basically everyone stayed. And that was amazing. And true irony is, in my back of the envelope calculation of the money I thought I'd have to put aside to retain everyone, actually would have been more than they received. But I would have missed out on the training and some of the other things. And all those employees, although some of them did have to relocate and take jobs in other locations, not as convenient, they all were reemployed, and to my knowledge, at equal or better wages than they were receiving at the time we shut down the 4 sites.
And what was the reaction of that board of directors when they saw these retention plans? Were they optimistic about them? How did they react?
They approved it, and they were, when it was submitted, they were surprised that the employees actually, I mean, we had to dress up the wording.
Right.
But it was the employees' recommendation, and it was presented that this is what the employees recommend from these 4 sites to stay until the release date. And it took no time for board approval.
And that, I'm assuming that was surprising for the board, that actually the employees suggested the solution.
Right. Yeah, well, that tied in, and I know this is a little off track, in that in the business unit I was part of, we believed, and we tied it together with action learning, the work belief system. And I think I've sent you something where decisions are best made closest to the people and by the people who are doing the work.
Right.
And the people that know what the issues are the people that are doing the work. You make that business philosophy with action learning, and you have a very, very powerful workforce. And within our business unit, at the time, we had around 1,200 employees. So you're not talking a small workforce.
Thanks so much, Frank. If anybody of you guys who are watching this, if you guys have any questions, make sure you type them in the chat box right now. And I have one more question for you, Frank. Looking at this problem, looking at this situation and what was done, do you have any other tips or suggestions or advice for people watching this webinar, for coaches, trainers, maybe managers who are facing some problems in their corporations, in their companies? Are there any other conclusions that you can draw out of this situation?
Well, I'll take the conclusions in about 2 or 3 different parts, because you asked, I think, 3 questions in there if I dissected it.
Okay.
One, if let's say you're coaching or doing coaching, watch that your attendees are asking open-ended questions. Be mindful of the closed-ended questions, and be mindful that they sort of put a conclusion to the solution, or a solution in quote unquote the form of a question, way before you're actually to that point. To managers, it's more saying, helping them understand that, look, you've had this problem or issue, you've followed your traditional methods of solving it, and they were unsuccessful. And then you also can point to things like, in the US, a lot of corporations like Six Sigma as a problem solver. But action learning is part of Six Sigma. You can point to DuPont, that in order to be an executive in DuPont, you better know action learning. So you find examples of how major corporations like Boeing and Microsoft have now internal trainers that were trained by a certified action learning coach to use it within their corporations. I don't know if that helps.
I'm sure that helps. If you guys who are watching this, if you're interested in more examples on how action learning was used in business, and actually not only in business, also in government organizations and nonprofit organizations, there's a book devoted entirely to case studies from organizations around the world in which action learning was used for different purposes, like production problem solving, sales, marketing, finance, restructuring, and things like that. And it's available on Amazon, and it's called Breakthrough Problem Solving Through Action Learning. If you have any trouble finding it and you would like some links and maybe some more links to some other literature on action learning, make sure you contact me through ylpoland.org. If you go to ylpoland.org, actually, everybody who is watching this, you got my email with the notification and reminders about this webinar. If you need links to literature and to the book I mentioned with some more case studies on action learning being used in business and other organizations, just contact me or try to Google breakthrough problem solving through action learning. We'll be wrapping up very soon. Again, if you have any questions, make sure you type them in the chat box. If anybody is interested in the School of Action Learning that we run in Poland for consultants, trainers, human resource professionals, and managers, we have no free places for March. Actually, the March edition is running right now. No free places for April, but we do have some free places for May. So if you go to, actually on the webpage where you're watching this, there's a link up there. There's a link to the School of Action Learning. You can check it out and sign up if you want, but we only have places for May. If you need some more explanation and you'd like to talk more, you can also schedule a consultation call with me, and I will do my best to help you guys decide if action learning is something for you or not, if this is the path that you would like to take, and I can answer some more questions on how we learn together in the School of Action Learning. Frank, thank you so much for telling us about the two problems and what was done and the effects that you saw. One final question: as a manager, as an executive, what would you generally expect from somebody who is just coming from the outside, from a consultant or a team coach or a trainer running your workshop? What would be your main expectations?
My main expectations would be that they show me some benefits from following the process before, and that they carefully explain why it's different and so powerful. I mean, I obviously talked about two of the situations, but we did use action learning for a reorganization, and that was a small group meeting once a week for about 3 months. Right. And in a nonprofit, we used it for strategic planning. So there are many uses for action learning, and I think someone talking to a manager who truly doesn't know or understand it, being able to give some examples and some easy references where they can read about it and then talk to someone who has experienced it. I think talking to a person that actually has lived action learning really can help, I'll use the term, sell it to a client.
Thank you, Frank. We do have one question. I'm not sure if you can answer it, but maybe you can. The question is, how does action learning work, and does it work out in different environments, different cultures? And are there any differences in implementing it. Do you have any experiences or knowledge about action learning being implemented in different organizations, maybe different cultures?
I don't have the personal experience, but I am closely related to someone who has the personal experience. And when you go to a different culture, say if you're down in Brazil teaching action learning coaches, or you're over in New Zealand demonstrating action learning, you must be aware of the local cultures. So is it appropriate, like here in the US, someone sitting on a desk or leaning back on a desk while making a presentation is accepted? In New Zealand, that is not acceptable. So, and phrasing, when you switch languages, and I obviously know your audience is Polish, and sadly I do not know how to speak Polish. Certain phrases in one language, if you're going to another language, even with a translator, don't translate the way you would like. So misinterpretation is something you have to watch out for, especially if you're going through a translator. Work through the translator, roughly what you're going to say, how you're going to say it, and look out to make sure, A, you don't offend anyone, and B, the message you are sending actually is the message that's sent.
Right.
And then comprehended and understood.
Yeah. And also what I can, building on what you said, Frank, what I can add is, I think actually, I mean, we have proofs, we have evidence that action learning does work in different environments. So you have to take into consideration these different aspects that Frank just mentioned that are somehow around doing action learning and how you behave and how you speak. But I think while the World Institute for Action Learning has the greatest number of coaches in the US and in China, two different cultures. Actually, Asia is pretty big on action learning, which is kind of counterintuitive because they're not very big on asking questions and sort of challenging one another, especially at work. But somehow they like action learning. I know a person who does action learning in Burma. So really, it will work in every culture because it's so simple and it's based on universal assumptions of how people learn. But you have to be careful how you implement it, obviously taking into account all these cultural issues. There's one more question here. Do you think, Frank, that it's really worth training people in action learning before actually using it, before running the first session? Because this is what Mike did in the first example, as far as I understand, as far as we all understand it here. So would you say it's worth training people beforehand? Or maybe it's just okay to just start it like that and let it run?
Both approaches work. We at Constellation actually put action learning, training of action learning, a half-day session in our leadership development program, which actually was basically 3 one-week sessions separated, but one of the half-day sessions was on action learning. So our managers and shift leaders, and we included technicians, became accustomed to asking open-ended questions to really solve the simple problems without even going to a formal action learning session. So we put it in the training. I'd say if you have the opportunity to educate people on action learning, don't spend too much time. And the quicker you get into solving a problem, the faster people understand. But you do need at least an hour or 2 hours to understand the basics because it is so different than your traditional way of teaching, learning, and problem solving.
Yeah, my approach is exactly the same. And what I want to underline from what you said, Frank, is that you don't have to use action learning or you don't have to teach action learning only so that they do the pure form of action learning. You can teach action learning to people so that they learn how to ask questions that they can use on an everyday basis in their work, not really doing action learning sessions, but maybe analyzing problems better, asking questions of each other before forming solutions, maybe communicating with each other better, maybe understanding different perspectives and being able to take advantage of them rather than treating different perspectives as an obstacle. So treat action learning as a flexible tool for improving people's performance, not only for like group problem solving, although that too. Okay, I don't see any other questions, so we will be wrapping up right now. Frank, I would like to thank you for joining us in this webinar. It was wonderful to have you here and hearing about all those examples and your reflections. Thanks very much.
Well, thank you for having me, and it's a pleasure seeing you.
Thanks again. Frank and I will stay connected, and I will finish this webinar right now with all of you guys. I'm keeping my fingers crossed for your work. Stay healthy, stay well, and I will see you probably in the next webinar next week. I'll send you some emails, and if you need anything, if you need links to the literature or whatever, just respond to the email notifications that you received from me, and we will be in touch. Have a good evening, have a good night, and I'll talk to you soon. Thank you so much, and good night.